A map is supposed to remove uncertainty. It tells an army where the roads run, where the rivers can be crossed, and which hill must be captured before the enemy reaches it. But a map is not the ground. It is only ink, paper, measurements, and assumptions. If one road is drawn in the wrong place, an entire column can arrive hours late. If two farms have similar names, artillery can fire at the wrong target. If a ridge looks gentle on paper but rises like a wall in reality, thousands of soldiers can walk directly into a trap. These 8 battles were not lost by maps alone. Armies also failed because of poor leadership, weak intelligence, hesitation, weather, and enemies who understood the terrain better. But in every case, somebody trusted the wrong lines on a page. The soldiers paid for it on the ground. Number 8. The Battle of the Nye River, 1864. During the American Civil War, Union General Orlando Wilcox received orders to move toward a location identified as the Gate, northeast of Spotsylvania Courthouse. The order appeared simple. Find the gate, cross the surrounding roads, and threaten the Confederate position from an unexpected direction. Wilcox moved forward on May 9, 1864. His division followed local roads through heavily wooded Virginia countryside, where trees restricted visibility and small lanes twisted between farms. Then he reached a driveway near the Gale House. Wilcox believed he had found the gate marked in his orders. He had not. The actual location was farther north. The map and the landmarks did not match clearly enough, and the Union division had drifted into the wrong position. Instead of appearing where the wider federal plan required him, Wilcox crossed the Eye River and became involved in an isolated engagement with Confederate cavalry and infantry. His troops pushed forward, but their movement no longer supported the main Union effort. Confederate forces concentrated against them, and Wilcox eventually withdrew. This was not the greatest defeat of the Civil War. It was something more ordinary and therefore more revealing. A division had marched, fought, and suffered because its commander believed one gate was another gate. The map had converted a driveway into an objective. The Confederates did the rest. Number 7. The Battle of Waterloo, 1815. Waterloo has been analyzed more closely than almost any battle in history. Napoleon's late start, the muddy ground, the resistance at Hougoumont, the arrival of the Prussians, and the failure of the Imperial Guard all contributed to the French defeat. There is also a disputed cartographic explanation. A map associated with Napoleon's headquarters contained errors in the placement of several important features. Most famously, the farms of Mont Saint-Jean and La Haye-Sainte may have been confused because a major road was shown on the wrong side of one location. On a modern map, the difference seems minor. On a battlefield, the farms were reference points. Officers used them to describe positions, direct movements, and estimate where Wellington's center stood behind the ridge. If Napoleon or his staff misidentified one farm as another, French calculations could be displaced by hundreds of yards. Artillery officers might believe they were firing into the center of Wellington's position while aiming at ground that did not match the command's mental picture. The argument remains controversial. No serious historian can reduce Waterloo to a single badly drawn road. French attacks also suffered from poor coordination, exhausted troops, strong Allied defensive positions, and the steady arrival of Prussian forces. But the map error exposes a deeper problem. Napoleon was trying to control a battlefield he could not see completely. Wellington placed much of his army behind a reverse slope. Smoke covered the field. Rain had softened the earth. Messengers carried incomplete reports between commanders. The map was supposed to create clarity. Instead, it may have reinforced a false picture. At Waterloo, Napoleon did not merely fight Wellington. He fought the distance between the page and the landscape. Number 6. The Battle of Fredericksburg, 1862. In December 1862, Union General Ambrose Burnside planned a 2-part assault against Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army at Fredericksburg, Virginia. One wing would attack south of the city. The other would assault the Confederate defenses behind Fredericksburg, including the position near Mary's Heights. The southern attack offered the better opportunity. Confederate troops under Stonewall Jackson held a long defensive line, but part of that line contained a vulnerable gap. Burnside's orders to Major General William Franklin, however, were vague. The terrain shown on Union maps was also inaccurate. Franklin had expected to launch the main attack with tens of thousands of men. The written order told him to send at least one division forward and keep the rest ready. Instead of treating the instruction as the beginning of a massive offensive, Franklin interpreted it narrowly. Only part of his force advanced with real determination. The Union troops briefly penetrated Jackson's line. For a moment, they created the opening Burnside needed, but Franklin did not commit enough reserves to exploit it. Confederate forces closed the gap and drove the attackers back. Burnside then continued sending brigades against Marye's Heights. Union soldiers crossed open ground toward Confederate infantry, protected behind a stone wall. Attack followed attack. None broke through. The Army of the Potomac suffered more than 12,000 casualties during the battle. The map did not order those frontal assaults. Burnside did, but the inaccurate picture of the southern terrain helped create confusion between Burnside and Franklin. The commander believed one thing was happening. His subordinate believed he had been ordered to do something smaller. Both men were reading the same battle differently. Lee's army only had to remain behind the wall. Number 5. The Battle of Tanga, 1914. When the First World War began, Britain attempted to capture the German East African port of Tanga. The operation looked manageable on paper. Britain could transport thousands of troops by sea, land near the town, overwhelm the small German colonial force, and remove a useful enemy port. Major General Arthur Aitken commanded roughly 8,000 British and Indian soldiers. The German commander, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, initially had far fewer men available, but the British possessed poor intelligence and inadequate knowledge of the area. Maps could identify the coastline, roads, and general shape of Tanga. They could not show commanders exactly what waited inside the plantations, thick vegetation, drainage channels, and narrow approaches around the town. British troops landed on November 3, 1914. Units became confused almost immediately. Some soldiers were inexperienced. Officers struggled to maintain control in dense terrain. Formations lost contact with one another. The following day, the British advanced toward Tanga. German askaris fired from concealed positions. British units repeatedly received contradictory reports about where friendly and enemy forces were located. Men fired toward movement they could not identify. Others stopped because they believed troops ahead of them might be British. Then disturbed bee colonies added to the disorder. The bees did not defeat the British army. German gunfire, poor preparation, and collapsing command did that. But swarms attacking frightened soldiers became the perfect symbol for an operation in which almost nothing matched the clean plan prepared before the landing. Aitken ordered a withdrawal. The British abandoned rifles, ammunition, machine guns, telephones, and supplies. Lettow-Vorbeck recovered equipment that his small colonial force urgently needed. The invaders had brought the Germans their next shipment of weapons. The map had shown a port, it had not shown a battlefield. Number 4. The landing at Anzac Cove, 1915. The Allied invasion of Gallipoli required soldiers to land on narrow beaches, climb to the high ground, and cross the peninsula before Ottoman forces could organize a defense. The plan depended on speed. It also depended on maps that were barely adequate. British planners initially relied on a War Office map derived from an old French survey. It lacked the detail needed for an amphibious assault across broken ground. Heights were inaccurate. Ravines and ridges were simplified. One compass bearing was later found to be approximately 2 degrees wrong. On April 25, 1915, Australian and New Zealand troops came ashore north of the intended landing area, in country far more difficult than many had expected. The ground rose sharply from the beach. Ridges split into narrow spurs. Deep gullies cut through the hills. Thick scrub concealed paths and separated units. The soldiers could see their objectives on the map. They could not find a direct route to them. In one documented example, New Zealand troops moving between Plugs Plateau and Russell's Top expected the features to be easily connected. The map suggested manageable ground. In reality, a thin and nearly impassable razorback stood between them. The troops had to descend, detour through a valley, and climb again. Every delay gave Ottoman commanders more time. Mustafa Kemal recognized the importance of the heights and moved troops forward without waiting for complete instructions. Ottoman defenders reached critical ground while Allied units were still struggling through ravines below. By the end of the first day, the Anzacs held a narrow perimeter instead of the commanding terrain required by the plan. The campaign continued for months. Accurate maps gradually replaced the originals, but by then the defenders had trenches, artillery positions, and reinforced lines. The Allies eventually evacuated. The old map was corrected. The lost hours were not. Number 3. The Battle of Stormberg, 1899. During the Second Boer War, British Lieutenant General William Gatakrey attempted a night march against Boer forces near Stormberg Junction in South Africa. The plan called for his column to approach under darkness, surprise the Boers, and seize their position before daylight. It required accurate navigation. The maps were reported to be dangerously unreliable. Roads were shown incorrectly. Distances were misleading. Contours gave a false impression of the hills. Gatakrey's guides also became confused. His force left on the evening of December 9, 1899. Soldiers marched for hours across unfamiliar ground. Many had already endured a long railway journey. The route stretched farther than expected. At some point, the column turned incorrectly. Instead of approaching the Boer position from the planned direction, Gatakrey's men arrived beneath steep ground they had not expected to face. The element of surprise was disappearing. Dawn approached. Gatakrey ordered an attack. British infantry climbed a rocky slope under rifle fire. Units became mixed together. Some soldiers reached ground from which they could not advance. Others received orders to withdraw before understanding what had happened. Boer forces threatened the British flanks. Gatakrey pulled back. The retreat became chaotic. Hundreds of British soldiers were left behind and captured, partly because commanders did not realize where all their units had gone during the night march. Stormberg became the first disaster of Britain's Black Week, a sequence of defeats that shocked the Empire in December 1899. The operation had been designed as a surprise attack. The British surprised themselves. Number 2. The attack at Magersfontein, 1899. One day after Stormberg, another British army advanced toward Boer positions at Magersfontein. Lieutenant General Lord Methuen was attempting to relieve the besieged town of Kimberley. The British believed Boer defenders occupied the heights around Magersfontein Hill. That belief shaped the artillery bombardment and the infantry plan, but Boer General Piet Cronje and General Cos de la Rey had placed many of their riflemen in trenches at the base of the hills rather than along the summit. The position was difficult to detect from a distance. The British mental map showed the enemy on the high ground. The Boers were waiting below it. Before dawn on December 11, the Highland Brigade advanced in a tightly packed formation. The soldiers moved through darkness and rain, intending to deploy when they approached the expected defensive line. They were already dangerously close. Boer riflemen opened fire from concealed trenches. The front of the British formation collapsed. Men behind them could not immediately see what had happened. Some troops lay exposed for hours. Unable to move forward or retreat safely, British artillery had shelled the hills. The main Boer line remained largely untouched beneath them. Magersfontein was not caused by a printing error in one map. It was a failure to map the enemy correctly onto the terrain. British commanders interpreted the hill according to conventional doctrine. They assumed defenders would use the crest or upper slopes. The Boers ignored that expectation. Methuen's force suffered a severe defeat and stopped its advance toward Kimberley. The British had located the hill accurately. They had placed the battle on the wrong part of it. Number 1. The Battle of Modder River, 1899. Modder River technically ended as a British victory, but it belongs in this story because it shows how a map can turn even success into near disaster. Before the battle, British intelligence suggested that the Modder and Riet rivers could be crossed at many points. The maps were rough, and parts of the river system were incorrectly drawn. Lord Methuen therefore advanced without understanding how strongly the rivers restricted movement. The Boer defenders used the landscape far more effectively. Instead of sitting visibly on high ground, they dug positions near the riverbanks, where the flat terrain and vegetation concealed them. On November 28, 1899, British troops approached what appeared to be an open route. Boer rifle fire struck them from hidden positions. The British infantry became pinned across exposed ground under intense heat. Officers struggled to determine the exact shape of the enemy line. The rivers, which were supposed to offer multiple crossing points, limited movement instead. British artillery and determined infantry attacks eventually forced the Boers to withdraw. Methuen controlled the field at the end of the day, but the victory cost roughly 450 British casualties. The maps had not merely omitted details. According to later criticism, they had misrepresented roads, river courses, distances, contours, and the availability of fords. Modder River revealed the problem. Stormberg and Magersfontein confirmed it. Within 2 weeks, British forces had repeatedly entered South African battles using paper representations that the landscape refused to obey. The Empire possessed railways, modern artillery, machine guns, and global communications. The Boers possessed the ground. That was enough. The final lesson is simple. Maps do not have to be completely wrong to become dangerous. A single misplaced road can confuse a headquarters. A missing ravine can delay an assault. A misunderstood hill can protect an entire defensive line. A familiar name attached to the wrong gate can pull a division away from the real battle. The commanders in these stories were not defeated because they looked at maps. They were defeated because they stopped questioning them. The best officers treated maps as arguments that had to be tested by scouts, local guides, aerial observation, patrols, and direct examination of the terrain. The worst treated them as reality. Ink does not become more accurate because thousands of soldiers are following it, and once an army begins marching in the wrong direction, the enemy rarely corrects the mistake.